She sold me with a smile on her face. That's the part nobody believes. Not the blood debt. Not the man I was delivered to like something owed. The smile. I had spent 23 years convincing myself she loved me in whatever broken way she was capable of. She signed the paperwork before I was even out of the car. The strangest thing, the thing that will take me a long time to explain, is that the man waiting inside that room was not the danger.
She was.
She had always been. If you've ever loved someone who is quietly counting the cost of you, stay. This story is for you. Subscribe so you don't lose it. The drive from the airstrip took 40 minutes. I know because I counted the overhead lights on the highway, the way I used to count ceiling tiles in the apartment when her voice got low and careful and I needed something to hold. There were 112 lights. I didn't look out the window.
There wasn't a reason to.
Whatever Frankfurt was, it had stopped mattering the moment my mother pressed her palm flat to my back at the departure gate in a gesture that looked, to anyone watching, like tenderness. Like a mother seeing her daughter off. She kept it there until the gate agent looked away. Then she leaned close, her perfume thick as a closed room, and told me that if I made a scene, she would make sure the next girl they sent would be younger. I didn't make a scene. The man driving didn't speak. Neither did the one beside him. They weren't interested in me as anything other than cargo to be delivered without damage, and I understood that with the clean, airless understanding of someone who has been cargo before, managed, directed, placed. My left hand was loose in my lap. My right hand was memorizing the door handle. The building didn't look like power from the outside. Old limestone, set back from the street, the kind of facade that has absorbed 2 centuries of weather and stopped caring about it. The Kentucky State Capitol's dome was visible in the distance, lit gold against the dark sky. Something about the distance between those 2 buildings felt like a language I didn't speak yet. They walked me through a side entrance. Marble floors, the smell of wood smoke and something beneath it. Old paper, maybe, or the particular dryness of rooms that have been sealed and reopened too many times. No one in the corridor looked at me. Not avoidance. Just the practiced indifference of people who have learned not to register arrivals. We stopped at a set of double doors. One knock. Then they opened without waiting. The room was warmer than I expected. That was the first thing. A fire in the grate, low and steady. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the river threading through the dark below like something that had forgotten to stop moving. He was standing at those windows with his back to me. I had been told things about Ezra del Santini. My mother had told me some. The men who transported me had said nothing, which told me more. I had assembled, from scraps and silences, a version of him that I could survive knowing about.
Old.
Dangerous. The kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice because it has never had to. What I had not assembled was this. The white of his suit in firelight, the silver of his hair, the way he turned from the window not with the slow deliberateness of someone performing control but with the particular efficiency of someone who has stopped wasting movement entirely. He looked at me the way you look at a document that contains different information than you were told it would. Not threat. Assessment. The men who had brought me were already gone. I hadn't heard the door close. He crossed the room, not toward me but to the side, putting himself at an angle, and studied my face. The bruising above my cheekbone. The way I was holding my left arm bracketed against my ribs.
He didn't reach for me.
He stood at a distance that was precise, almost architectural, like he had calculated exactly how close was close enough to see clearly and how far was far enough that I wouldn't back away. I kept my eyes on the middle distance. A learned thing. Eyes down invited certain responses. Eyes up invited others. The middle distance was neutral ground. Who did this? Not a question. The flatness of someone eliminating variables. I said nothing for a moment. I was deciding whether the truth was more dangerous than silence, and I was making that calculation with the tired efficiency of a woman who has been making it since she was small. My mother. The words tasted the way they always tasted, like something I'd swallowed wrong. He didn't move, didn't react. The fire made a small sound behind the grate. a shift of wood, and the room was otherwise completely still. But something changed in the quality of the silence, the way a room's air changes before a storm that hasn't arrived yet.
He was looking at me differently now.
Not with pity. I knew pity. I could have withstood pity. This was something more careful than that. The look of someone recalibrating.
Sit down, he said.
I didn't move. My legs had made the decision before I did, locked, weight distributed, the stance of a body that has learned not to comply until it understands what compliance will cost. Something crossed his face. Not impatience. Recognition. He turned, went to a cabinet against the far wall, poured something amber into a glass, and set it on the table nearest me without crossing into my space to do it. Then he returned to the window. He was giving me the room. I didn't know what to do with that. I stood there, wet from the November air that had come off the river, my dress plastered to my arms, and I couldn't move toward the glass or away from it because I had no framework for a man who gives you the room. My mother's voice, clear as a struck bell. You are wretched. You have always been wretched. The kindest thing I ever did for you was find you a use. I picked up the glass. Not because I trusted him, because my hands needed something to do. The whiskey was warm going down, and the warmth spread through my chest like something I hadn't earned. He was still at the window.
Still not looking at me.
The city below us continued its business. A barge on the river, the slow rotation of a light somewhere across the water. Who told you to come here? She didn't tell me anything. My voice was steadier than I deserved. She arranged it. There's a difference. He turned from the window then. Fully. And whatever calculation he had been running behind those amber eyes came to some quiet, private conclusion. What you were brought here to become, he said, is not something I'm going to make you. I held the glass with both hands. I had prepared, on the long flight over, for many things. Negotiation.
Cruelty.
The specific performance of power that men use when they want you to understand you have none. I had not prepared for this. Why, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of looking that does not blink, that takes inventory, that has been doing this long enough to know the difference between what a person shows and what a person is. Because, he said, whoever told you what you were worth was wrong. The fire made its small sound again. I did not believe him. I noticed that I wanted to. The glass was empty. I didn't remember finishing it. That was the state I was in, not afraid, not hopeful, not anything I could point to and name. Just present in the way you are when the worst has already been decided, and all that remains is watching it arrive. My mother would have called it peace. She called a lot of things peace that weren't. Ezra had returned to his chair behind the desk. He hadn't told me to sit. He also hadn't told me to stand, and so I was still standing, and the fire had burned down by a degree I could feel on the back of my neck, and neither of us had spoken in long enough that the silence had settled into something almost comfortable. That was what made me start talking. Comfortable silences are the most dangerous kind. They make you believe you are safe enough to fill them. I told him about the insurance policy first because it was the most concrete thing. Numbers, dates, a beneficiary line with my mother's name in the space where a person's name goes. $10.5 million. I had seen the document once, by accident, in a folder she had left open on the dining table the night before I was flown out. She had not tried to hide it. That was the part that had taken my breath. She hadn't bothered. He didn't write anything down. Didn't reach for a phone. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes on me and listened the way very few people listen, without preparing his response, without waiting for a pause to insert himself, without the small adjusting movements that signal a person is really only half there. So I kept going. The charity came next. Benin Import Aid, registered in Malta, operating offices in Frankfurt, a humanitarian mission printed on every letterhead and embossed on every gala invitation. My mother had built it over 11 years, and for the first 3, it had actually done what it claimed. That was what made the architecture so effective. You cannot fake legitimacy. You have to buy it with something real, And then, once the name is trusted, once the donors are invested, once the journalists have written their warm profiles, then you put the infrastructure to other work. Women, mostly young,
Some not young.
brought across on legitimate visas, placed in temporary housing, then redirected. My mother had a phrase for the transition. She called it reallocation of resources. I had heard her use it on the phone. I had not understood it until I found the second set of files on a drive she did not know I had accessed. Names.
Dates.
Reference numbers instead of identities. I was listed in the third column of a spreadsheet that tracked what she called uncooperative assets. My name. A date from 8 months ago. A note that read, reallocation pending. I told him all of this standing in the middle of his office with a fire at my back, my voice doing the thing it does when I have moved past the place where feeling is useful, flat, sequential, like reading coordinates off a map. I had rehearsed none of it. There was nothing left in me that understood the point of rehearsal. When I finished, the room was very quiet. He had not moved, had not looked away. His expression was the same one he had been wearing since I walked in. Not neutral, exactly, but contained, the face of someone who has learned over a very long time to keep what he knows from showing before he is ready to use it. The fire shifted behind the grate. A single sound. 11 years, he said. At least. That's how far back the second set of files goes. He was quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Not the silence of someone waiting to speak, but the silence of someone deciding what the information changes. How many women? I looked at the window. The river was still there, still moving. I stopped counting at 63. There were more pages. I don't know what I expected him to do with that. Rage, maybe, the kind of controlled, expensive rage that men like him are supposed to perform when they have been made party to something without their consent. Or calculation. The rapid pivot to what this means for him, for his position, for the transaction that had just collapsed. He did neither. He stood, crossed to the window. Stood beside it rather than in front of it, not looking out, just placing himself near the glass the way people do when they need a wall at their back, without admitting they need it. She sent you here expecting I wouldn't ask questions, he said. She sent me here expecting you to see an opportunity. She was wrong about what I find valuable. I didn't answer that. It didn't seem to require one. The room breathed around us, the low tick of something cooling in the walls, the fire's quiet work, the muffled press of the city 40 feet below. My feet ached. I had been standing since the airstrip. I didn't sit down. Sitting felt like a concession I hadn't priced yet. He turned from the window and looked at me, and the look was different from the ones before it. The assessment was over. Whatever he had been calculating, he had calculated it. Do you want to live? For words. I opened my mouth. Closed it. The question sat in the air between us the way questions do when they are not rhetorical and not cruel and not a test, when they are simply real, simply waiting, simply requiring an answer that the person being asked has never once been invited to give. I had been told what to do, where to go, what I cost and what I owed, and what I was worth to the woman who had assigned my worth. I had been told what I was, wretched, ungrateful, a drain on patience and resources, and I had been told what would happen to me, and I had been told implicitly and then explicitly that my preferences in the matter were beside the point. No one had ever asked what I wanted. The question was so simple, it was almost cruel. For words in a quiet room in a city I didn't know, from a man I had no reason to trust, in a night that had already taken more from me than I had planned to give. Do you want to live? My throat did something, tightened or opened, I couldn't tell which. My hands, which had been still for the last hour, started moving. I pressed them flat against my thighs. I knew the answer. I had known it since I was small, since before the word wretched had been said so many times it stopped sounding like an accusation and started sounding like a name. The knowing and the saying were different countries, and I had no papers for the crossing. I don't know how to answer that, I said finally. He nodded.
Once.
Like that was the most honest thing I could have given him. That's all right, he said. You have until morning. He walked to the door and opened it, and a woman appeared, 50s, unhurried, with the particular composure of someone who has managed difficult situations long enough that difficult is just Tuesday. She looked at me without pity, which was the most respectful thing anyone had done for me all day. I followed her out of the room. Behind me, the question stayed exactly where he had left it. Waiting. The woman's name was Petra. She told me this in the elevator, not as introduction but as information. The way you tell someone the floor number, practically, without expecting a response. She had silver-streaked hair pulled back without vanity and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years in proximity to danger and learned to move through it without disturbing it. She didn't ask how I was. I was grateful for that in a way I couldn't have explained at the time. The room was on the 4th floor. She opened the door, set a key card on the table just inside, and told me there was food in the small refrigerator, that the phone on the nightstand reached the kitchen directly if I wanted something warm, that the doctor would come at 9 in the morning, and that I was not obligated to let her in. Not obligated, I repeated. Your choice, Petra said. Everything in this room is your choice. She left before I could answer. The door closed softly, not pulled shut, just released, the latch catching without effort, and I stood in the entrance of the room and didn't move for a long moment because the room was large and I was trying to locate the thread in it. There wasn't one. That was the problem. I had spent 23 years reading rooms the way other people read weather, the angle of a shoulder, the quality of a silence, the specific register of footsteps in a hallway. Safety, in my experience, was not the absence of threat. It was threat holding still. It was the moment before, stretched thin, and you learned to live in that moment because living was what you did in the spaces between. This room had no before. It was just quiet.
Warm.
A bed with more pillows than any bed requires, a window overlooking the river, a lamp on the nightstand that cast light the color of late afternoon even though it was the middle of the night. I sat on the edge of the bed, stood up again immediately, sat back down. My dress was still damp at the hem from the walk between the car and the building. I could smell the November river on it, cold, faintly mineral, the particular sharpness of water moving fast over limestone. I hadn't noticed the cold until now. My body had been managing other priorities. I told myself I would lie down for a few minutes. I told myself I would not sleep because sleeping in an unknown place, with an unknown man somewhere in the floors below, was not something I was prepared to do. I was asleep within 4 minutes. I know this because I woke 3 hours later in the same position I'd sat down in, upright, feet still on the floor, and the lamp was still on, and the river was still visible through the window, and I was still alive. I ran the bath because the alternative was sitting in the too large room counting the things my mother's voice was telling me about it. The water came out scalding, which was a choice I made deliberately because the cold in my bones had become structural by then, the kind of cold that lives in the architecture of a person rather than just their surface. I turned it down only when my hand, testing it, sent a clear enough signal. Then I lowered myself in and sat there. No one came to the door. No one knocked. No one appeared in the hallway, making noise designed to remind me that time was being used, that water was a resource, that I was, as always, taking more than I'd earned. I sat until the water went from scalding to warm, then from warm to cool. The cooling was gradual enough that I kept adjusting to it without deciding to, my body recalibrating down the way it recalibrates in winter, accepting each new temperature as the normal one. By the time the water was cold, my fingers had gone soft at the edges and the window above the tub had fogged completely, and I still had not moved to get out. I was not crying.
I want to be precise about that.
It wasn't a breakdown. It was something quieter and more disorienting, the particular suspension of a person who has stopped bracing and doesn't yet know what to do with her own weight. I got out when I got cold enough that staying stopped being a choice. The mirror. I hadn't meant to look. The towel was on the rail to the left of it, and I was reaching for the towel, and there I was, full length, lit by the kind of bathroom light that doesn't negotiate. I stood there. The bruising above my cheekbone had darkened since the airstrip. It had moved from red into the deeper territory, purple-brown, the color of something that had been decided. Below my left eye, A cut I had not known was there had sealed itself into a thin, dark line. My collarbones were too visible, not from illness, just from years of the particular arithmetic of a household where resources were allocated by worthiness, and I had never been deemed worthy of enough. My shoulders were slightly forward. They had been slightly forward for as long as I could remember. A posture learned, so young it had become bone. I looked at all of this the way I would look at a stranger's face, cataloging, detached, noting information without attaching cost to it. This is what is here. This is the inventory. Then one thing stopped me. My eyes. They were open. Not wide. Not the wide-open look of someone performing alertness or fear. Just open. Looking back at me without the customary apology in them. I had not done that on purpose. I had known they could do it without my permission. I looked away first. The bed, when I got into it properly, sheets pulled back, pillow arranged, was the softest thing I had touched in years. Not luxury soft, though it was that too. The softness of something that had not been assigned conditions. I lay in the dark and waited for my mother's voice. It came a little. The old phrases, the old intonation. Wretched, ungrateful. The kindest thing I ever did. They arrived in the half-dark the way they always did, smaller than they sounded in actual rooms, thinner at the edges.
Do you want to live?
His question. Still there. Still waiting. I lay with it in the dark for a long time. The voice faded before I did. When sleep came for the second time, it came all the way down, heavy, total, the sleep of someone whose body has decided, without consulting the mind, that it is finally permitted to stop holding everything up. I did not dream about her. That was the first time in 3 years that I did not dream about her. I did not know that yet. I only found out in the morning, when I woke and the room was pale with early light, and the river was still there, and I was still, against all of my careful preparations, alive. Waking without dread is its own kind of disorientation. I lay in the pale morning light and waited for the familiar machinery to engage, the calculation of mood, the reading of ambient sound, the assessment of what the day was likely to cost before it had properly begun. The machinery didn't come. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when no one in them is managing you, and my body didn't know what to do with that, so it just lay there, breathing, while the light moved slowly across the ceiling. Petra had left clothes folded on the chair by the window. I hadn't heard her come in. That should have alarmed me more than it did. I dressed in what was there. Dark trousers, a gray pullover that fit as though someone had taken an educated guess at my size and guessed correctly, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with my hands in my lap. I had survived the night. That was the complete thought. Not what came next, not what it meant, just I had survived the night, and the morning had arrived anyway, and now I was going to have to decide something. Ezra was in a room I hadn't seen before, 1 floor down, smaller than the office, with a long table and morning light coming in flat and gray from a north-facing window. A coffee service on a sideboard. 2 chairs set across from each other with the particular deliberateness of a room arranged for conversation, rather than authority. He was standing when I entered. He didn't move toward me. "Sit wherever you want," he said. I took the chair with its back to the wall. He noticed. He didn't remark on it. The coffee was already poured. I wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth do what warmth does, and I looked at him across the table and I said, "What did she offer you?" Not good morning. Not thank you for the room, for the bath, for the clothes that fit. 23 years of being trained into gratitude, and I still chose not to open with it, which told me something about the night I'd had. A debt settlement, he said. Benin Import Aid owed this house a considerable sum. She offered collateral. She offered me. Yes. And you accepted. He looked at me steadily. I accepted delivery. I hadn't agreed to terms. The distinction landed somewhere precise. I turned the cup in my hands, weighing it. That's a careful thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say. There's a difference between receiving a package and agreeing to what's inside it. She thought you'd open it and not ask questions. She thought I'd see a young woman and calculate an opportunity. He said it without inflection, The way you state a fact that reflects poorly on its subject without requiring editorial. She was wrong about what I consider an opportunity. I wanted to believe him. That's the honest part. I was sitting across from a man who had, by all available evidence, chosen not to kill me, and the wanting to believe was immediate and strong, and exactly the kind of response I had learned not to trust in myself. My mother had been very good at presenting as safe. It was her primary skill. So I kept my hands around the cup and my voice level, and I asked the question I actually needed answered. "What do you want from me?" "Your cooperation," he said. "Or nothing, if you prefer nothing." "What does cooperation mean?" He reached to the table beside him. I hadn't noticed the folder there, and set it between us. Didn't open it. Just placed it where I could reach it if I chose to. "Your mother's operation has been adjacent to my territory for 4 years. I knew it existed. I didn't know its scope."
He paused.
"What you told me last night changed the scope considerably." I looked at the folder.
Didn't touch it.
"You did this in one night." "I had people working through the night, yes." "On my information." "On information you gave freely to a man you had no reason to trust." He said it without judgment, just precision. I took that seriously. The folder sat between us. I could see it was thick, not one document but many, edges misaligned from being assembled quickly. The tab on the side had a single word written in a hand I didn't recognize. Benin. I put my coffee down and opened it. The first pages were financial records. I recognized the account structures. I had seen partial versions on my mother's drive, but these were complete, annotated, cross-referenced with dates and names and amounts that formed a shape I hadn't been able to see from the fragments I'd had. 11 years of systematic movement. Money in from donors who believed they were funding humanitarian work. Money out to a separate infrastructure, labeled in the files as logistics and staffing, which meant transport, and placement, which meant women. I turned the pages slowly. The name started on page 9. I recognized the third one. A girl from Valletta, 2 years younger than me, who had disappeared from her family's neighborhood 18 months ago. Her mother had gone to the police. The police had listed her as a voluntary departure, an adult woman who had chosen to leave. I had seen the listing online because my mother had shown it to me, smiling, as an example of how cleanly things could be managed. I set that page down face up on the table between us, and didn't speak for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, a bird somewhere, a single repeated note, then silence. "She showed me this girl's file," I said. "She showed it to me as a lesson." Ezra said nothing. He understood what kind of nothing was needed. "She was teaching me," I said, "that disappearing can look voluntary if you manage the paperwork correctly." The weight of that sat in the air. I let it sit. He gave me the complete choice. All of it, no conditions dressed up as options. He would give me money, enough to relocate, to begin, to become someone Rosaria Benedicta had no file on. A clean identity, travel documents, a contact in a city of my choosing who would ask no questions. I could walk out of this building this morning and by evening be untraceable.
Or
we take apart what she built. Together. With the documentation he had assembled and whatever I could add to it. He had legal contacts, investigative connections, reach into the structures her network operated beneath.
it would take time.
It would require me to be visible when visibility was the last thing my body wanted. "If I leave," I said, "what happens to the women still in her pipeline?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I closed the folder. I had told myself on the flight over that I was done. That whatever happened in Kentucky, it would be the last thing, the end of the account. I had arrived prepared to disappear, one way or another, and I had carried that preparation like luggage I was tired of the weight of. I was still tired of the weight. The girl from Valletta's name was on page 9. I lifted my chin. Show me what she built. The problem with choosing to fight is that the choice doesn't end when you make it. You make it again at 6 in the morning when Fiorella is waiting in the basement gym and every muscle from the previous day has filed a formal complaint. You make it again when Dr. Oganekaro asks you something quiet and precise that opens a door you'd prefer to leave closed, and you sit with the door open because closing it would mean admitting you'd rather be comfortable than honest. You make it every time Ezra spreads photographs across the table, the faces of Frankfurt's social architecture, the donors, the board members, the journalists who had written warmly about Benin import aid, and you realize that what you said yes to was not an event. It was a renovation of something that had been built wrong from the foundation. I had said, "Show me what she built." Nobody had told me I would also have to show them what I was. Fiorella had scars on her forearms that she did not explain and did not hide. She was compact and deliberate in her movements, the way people are when they have learned that economy is a form of safety, nothing wasted, nothing telegraphed, everything contained until it needed to be released. The first week she taught me how to stand. Not self-defense. Not strikes or holds or any of the practical things I had assumed we'd start with. Just how to occupy a position in a room without apologizing for it with my body. Feet level. Weight distributed. Shoulders back not as performance but as structure, the way a building is structured, because the alternative is eventual collapse.
I was terrible at it.
I kept drifting forward. Weight rolling to my toes, the old lean of a person always preparing to move fast or make herself smaller. Fiorella would correct me without speaking, a hand between my shoulder blades, steady, not pushing, just present, and I would straighten, and within 90 seconds I would drift forward again. On the fourth day she said, "Your body is still solving for the wrong problem." "What problem is it solving for?"
"Escape," she said.
"You're always ready to run. We're teaching it to stay." Dr. Oganekaro's office was a room on the second floor with 2 chairs and a window that looked into a courtyard where nothing much happened. He was a tall man with a careful voice and the habit of letting silences go longer than was comfortable, which I recognized as a technique and resented, and kept returning to anyway because the silences were where the real work got done. He asked me once, in the second week, what I thought I deserved. I said I didn't know. He said, "What did she tell you you deserved?" I said, "Less." He let that sit in the air for a long time, and I let it sit with him, and at some point in the sitting I understood that the question he had actually asked was not "What do you think you deserve?" It was "Can you locate the place where her answer became your answer, and could I begin carefully to tell them apart?" I was not good at this either. Progress, Dr. Oganekaro said, was not the same as speed. Ezra taught me names, faces, affiliations, the precise social weight of a well-timed silence in a room full of people who measured each other in fractions. He had been watching Frankfurt's elite for long enough that he spoke about them with the particular detachment of someone reviewing documents rather than people, their debts, their loyalties, the soft places in their reputations where pressure, applied correctly, would produce results. I was a fast study. My mother had always said this was my only useful quality, and for once, she had been accurate. What she had not anticipated was that I would turn it on her. The failure happened on a Thursday, 16 days in. Fiorella had set up a mock confrontation, a scenario where I was to respond to a series of accusations without retreating, physically or verbally, without the automatic lowering of my voice, without the old reflex to make myself agreeable at the cost of being true. She played my mother, not cruelly, not with accuracy, just with enough of the shape of it that the room began to feel like rooms I knew. She said, "You have embarrassed me. You have cost me. After everything I gave you, this is what you become." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Not silence chosen. Not silence deliberate. The kind of silence that belongs to a person who has temporarily vacated their own body, gone back somewhere older, smaller, to a version of herself who knew that speaking would make it worse and had learned, very early, to wait for it to be over. Fiorella stopped, put down the script, said nothing. Ezra was in the doorway. He had been watching. "Again tomorrow," he said. No disappointment in his voice. No reassurance either. Just a fact about what would happen next, offered without the weight of judgment attached.
He left.
I stood in the middle of the gym, and the air smelled of chalk and the rubber of the mat beneath my feet, and I breathed through the particular shame of a person who has tried to do something real and discovered their own limit. The shame was real. I went back the next morning anyway. That was the choice. Not the one I had made at the table with the folder. This smaller one, made alone in my room at 5 in the morning when I could have stayed in the bed and given any number of reasonable explanations for why today was not the day. The choice to return was the one nobody witnesses. It was the one that counted. 3 days later, I held a scenario for 4 minutes before my voice did what I asked of it. Fiorella said, "There it is." 2 words. I did not say thank you. I had been practicing that, not swallowing gratitude entirely, but distinguishing between gratitude that was real and gratitude that was a reflex trained into compliance. This one was real, but didn't need voicing. I nodded, and Fiorella nodded back, and that was the whole of it. That evening Ezra was in the study with a book he wasn't reading when I came in to return a file. I set it on the desk. Started to leave.
"Sit," he said.
Not a command. Something closer to an offering. I sat in the chair across from him. He returned to the book he wasn't reading. I looked at the courtyard through the window, where the November dark had come in early and the bare trees were doing nothing in particular. We stayed like that for a long time. No agenda. No instruction. No cost I could identify being accumulated on either side. I had not spent time in a room with another person and felt nothing threatening about it since I was very young enough that I could not retrieve the specific memory, only its quality, the way you remember warmth without remembering the exact afternoon. My shoulders were level. I noticed this because I had not told them to be. The steadiness was real.
I want to be clear about that.
It wasn't performance. Wasn't the careful management of a person holding herself together with both hands while something underneath pressed upward. 3 weeks in, I was sleeping through the night most nights. My shoulders stayed level in rooms where they used to rise. When Fiorella pushed me past the point where my body wanted to quit, I pushed back, not always cleanly, not always without cost, but I pushed back. Dr. Oganekaro said I was beginning to locate the difference between what I thought and what she had installed in me to think, and that the locating was the work, not the eliminating. I believed him. That was new, believing someone without spending the whole belief waiting for the correction. The steadiness was real. It just wasn't, as it turned out, the whole story. Petra brought me a tablet at 2:15 in the morning. She knocked first, which meant it was something she'd been told to bring and hadn't wanted to. I was awake already, not from dread, just the particular wakefulness that comes when a body has been repaired enough to notice things again, to lie in the dark and feel the quality of the air instead of just enduring it. I sat up. She handed me the tablet without speaking. The article was in Maltese. A cultural newspaper, Valletta-based, with a readership that overlapped precisely with every community my mother had spent 20 years building her reputation inside. The headline translated, without effort, in my head before I'd consciously read it. The daughter who vanished. The photograph was one I recognized. I was 12 in it, standing outside the church in Birkirkara after a Sunday service, squinting into summer light. My mother had her hand on my shoulder. She was smiling at the camera. I was smiling because I had been told to and had learned, by then, that the cost of not smiling was not worth calculating. She looked like a woman who loved her daughter. She was very good at looking like things. I read the article once. Then I read it again because the first time my eyes moved over the words without fully landing on them. The way you read something your brain is trying to protect you from absorbing too quickly. The second time I read it slowly, and I let it land. My mother was described as devastated, as a tireless advocate for vulnerable women who had spent 3 weeks unable to sleep or eat while searching for her only child. A source close to the family was quoted as saying that Bonnie had always been fragile, that she had been susceptible to manipulation, that the family feared she had been targeted by someone who recognized her vulnerability. I set the tablet face down on the bed. The room was cold in the way rooms go cold at 2 in the morning, that particular chill that comes through old windows regardless of the heating, and I sat in it and did not move for a while. I didn't hear Ezra come in. One moment I was alone, and the next he was in the chair across the room, not standing over me, not at the door, just settled into the chair as though he'd been there longer than he had. He had the look of someone who had also been awake, though with him it was impossible to tell if that was unusual. I didn't ask how he knew. Her lawyers contacted the Louisville faction this week, he said. They're willing to move against this territory in exchange for her debt being cleared. She's escalating. Yes. The gala is in 6 days. Yes. I looked at the window. The river was out there somewhere in the dark, moving the way it always moved, indifferent to the specificity of what was happening in this room. Do you think she ever meant it? I said. Any of it. When I was small. He didn't answer immediately. I had expected him to, expected the careful, informed answer of someone who had watched human nature long enough to have formed views on it. He had opinions about most things. He expressed them without ornamentation. He was quiet for long enough that I looked at him. He was looking back at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not pity. Something more serious than pity and more honest, and less useful for the purposes of making me feel better. He didn't answer. That was the answer. He was old enough to know that the true version of what I was asking wouldn't help me, and kind enough not to dress a useless truth in the clothing of comfort. He sat with me in the not knowing, and the sitting was the most honest thing anyone had offered me in 23 years, because it acknowledged that the question was real, that the grief inside it was real, without pretending there was a resolution that would make it hurt less. My eyes went hot. I didn't cry. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment and breathed through my nose, and the heat receded. He stayed in the chair. The room held us both. We sat there until the cold let up, which was a long time. He didn't fill the silence. Neither did I. At some point the quality of the dark outside the window began its slow adjustment toward morning, the black going to deep blue, going to the particular gray that arrives before anyone has asked for it. The gala, I said. 6 days. I'm not ready. He waited. There's a girl, I said. In her pipeline. The files Petra pulled last week. There's a name with a transit date, 3 weeks out. Yes. 3 weeks is not 6 days. No, he said. It isn't. I picked up the tablet, turned it face up, looked at the photograph of my 12-year-old self outside the church, squinting, smiling because I had been told to. I thought about the girl in the file. Whether someone had told her to smile, whether she had learned yet to make herself agreeable as a survival strategy, or whether she was still in the stage before, the stage where you believe that the people supposed to protect you will. I set the tablet down. What do I need to do in 6 days? I said, that I'm not doing yet. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands folded. The posture of someone shifting from witness to collaborator. Nothing, he said. You're ready. You've been ready for 4 days. You just haven't decided to know it yet. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, unhurried, the way someone looks when they have already reached the conclusion and are waiting for you to arrive at it on your own terms. I was not going to the gala because I was ready. I was going because there was a girl with a transit date and her clock did not care about mine. That was enough. It had always been enough, when I let it be. All right, I said. Preparation does not make the thing easier. It makes it possible. That is all it does, and I had to remind myself of this in the car on the way to the Grand Marquis, because my body had opinions about what we were doing that did not align with my decision to do it. My hands were cold despite the heated seats. The city moved past the window in amber and shadow, the Capitol dome lit against the December sky, the river catching light somewhere below the bridge, Frankfurt doing what Frankfurt always did, which was exist in the particular way of a city that has held power long enough to stop needing to announce it. Frankfurt is not like other cities. The old power here doesn't announce itself. It watches from the buildings that have been here longer than the state, and from the ones that look ordinary and aren't. I have seen women leave this city changed in ways they do not discuss. You can recognize them if you know what the before looks like. I knew. I had been the before. Ezra sat beside me without touching me. That was precise and correct. I needed the space around my body to be mine tonight, and he understood this without being told. He had spent the last 6 days understanding things without being told, which was its own form of fluency. "She'll move toward you immediately," he said. "She won't be able to help it." "I know. When she does." "I know," I said again. He was quiet after that. Outside, the hotel appeared. Limestone facade, warm light spilling from the entrance, the particular density of expensive cars that signals an event where reputation is the primary currency being exchanged. I did not tell him I was ready. I wasn't in the way that word usually means. I was something else, decided, which is different, and in some ways more durable. The room was already full when we entered. 300 people, maybe more, in the kind of formal dress that costs enough to serve as its own argument for the wearer's importance. The annual Frankfurt Heritage Gala had been running for 14 years. My mother had been its keynote donor for the last 6, which meant her name was on the program, on the centerpiece cards, on the large printed board near the entrance listing the evening's distinguished guests. I saw her name before I saw her. Rosaria Benedicta, philanthropist and humanitarian. Founder, Benin Import Aid. I kept walking. The screens were positioned around the ballroom's upper perimeter, 8 of them, conference-sized, currently displaying a rotating gallery of the charity's work. Children in bright clothing, women in training programs, the practiced visual language of compassion, assembled for maximum credibility. In 40 minutes, those screens would show something else. She found me in 12 minutes. I had expected 10, so she had exercised more restraint than usual. My mother moved through a room the way water moves downhill, with apparent effortlessness, always toward the lowest available point, which tonight was me. She was in navy blue, understated, the strategic opposite of the cream she'd worn at the last gala I'd attended on her arm. She had dressed like a woman who was not trying. She was always trying. She stopped 4 feet away. "Bonnie." Her voice was warm and carrying, warm enough for me, carrying enough for the people within range. "Thank God. I've been." "Don't," I said. One word. Level. My voice did not drop. Her eyes went very still behind the warmth, the way deep water goes still over a current. She recalibrated in less than a second. "Sweetheart, you've been through something difficult. Let's find somewhere." The screens went dark. The room noticed. Conversations dropped in register, heads turning, the collective attention of 300 people redirecting toward the upper perimeter. Then the video began. I had seen it in the technical room 10 days ago. I had thought I was prepared for what it would do to a ballroom. I was not fully prepared. The financial records came first, annotated, magnified, the movement of donated money into shell structures rendered visible in a format that required no expertise to understand. Then the operational documents. Then the names. 63 of them, with dates and reference numbers, and the column header my mother had written herself. Reallocation pending. The room went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a speaker. The specific quiet of people absorbing information that restructures what they believed about a person they trusted. I watched my mother's face. This is the part one did not expect, the grief of it. Not grief for her, exactly. Grief for the version of her I had never stopped hoping to find evidence of. The mother who had meant it once, even briefly, even imperfectly. I had carried that hope so long it had become structural, and watching her face in the moment her constructed world came apart, I saw only calculation, only the rapid assessment of exits, of allies, of which story might still hold, and the hope finally left. Cleanly, without drama. It hurt exactly as much as losing something real. I stood in it for one breath. Then the video reached my statement. My face filling the screens, my voice in the room speakers, calm and precise and entirely without performance, and my mother turned toward me. She switched to Maltese. This was her last card, and she played it with the fluency of someone who had used it for decades as a private weapon, the language of our home, our island, the tongue in which she had delivered every correction, every diminishment, every careful lesson about what I was and what I was worth. She spoke quietly, intensely, in the Maltese that meant this is between us, the register she used when she wanted to remind me that whatever happened in public, she owned what was private. She said I was confused. She said I had been manipulated by a man who saw my weakness. She said that whatever I thought I was doing, she was still my mother, and I would always be hers. The room didn't understand the words. They understood her face. And they were watching mine. I let her finish. Then I answered her in Maltese, slowly, in the same register, the one that means this is between us, so that she would know I had heard every word and chosen my response with full understanding of what she had tried to do. I said, "You called me wretched since I was 4 years old. I used to think you were describing me. I understand now you were describing what you needed me to be." I said, "I am not that anymore." My voice did not shake. My shoulders did not curve. I stood in the space I occupied without apologizing for the width of it, and I looked at my mother, really looked at her, the way you look at someone you are finally done being afraid of, and I held the look until she was the one who turned away. She turned away. That was the whole of it. Security moved toward her from the left. Journalists were already on their phones. The room began its controlled disintegration into the noise of people deciding what they had just witnessed and what it would cost the woman they had celebrated. Ezra was behind me, not close enough to touch, just present, the way a wall is present, not because you need to lean on it, but because knowing it's there changes how you stand. I stood without leaning. The fear I had carried into this room, the cold hands, the body bracing for impact, the 23 years of waiting for the blow, was gone. Not suppressed. Not managed.
Gone.
Like a sound that has stopped, and the stopping is so complete you can finally hear what the room actually sounds like. It was very quiet. I was still there. If something in this story felt familiar, not the specifics, but the weight of it, you're not alone. There are others who find their way to stories like this one. Women who needed to hear that surviving was only the beginning. Subscribe and stay close to this space. It's easy to lose and harder to find again.